I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
Princess Anne had faced royal funerals, family scandals, and decades of duty without allowing the world to see her break. But when a sealed archive file connected to Prince Philip was opened, and one crucial decree was found missing, her composure changed. The shock deepened when newly recovered access records appeared to connect Camilla's private office for the decree's removal. For Anne, this was no longer palace administration. It felt like a violation of her father's final authority. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne stared at the open file and read the inventory twice. Nothing changed. The signed instruction that should have been there was gone. Only after those first terrible seconds did the language around it begin to matter. A private decree, in this dramatized account, was a written instruction setting out how Philip wanted certain personal possessions, family papers, military keepsakes, and ceremonial objects protected or distributed after his death. It was not simply another palace memo. It carried his wishes, his judgment, and, for his daughter, something close to his final voice. The archivist confirmed that the decree had once been logged inside the protected file. Anne asked the question again, more quietly this time. Where was it now? The answer did not come. Charles received the same information in a separate briefing and understood the danger immediately. He studied the access evidence, closed the folder, and said nothing for several seconds. The king knew his sister would never see this as a minor filing error. Their father had spent a lifetime demanding order, discipline, and respect for responsibility. If someone had interfered with Philip's final instruction, then Anne would see it as something deeply personal. Charles also knew why the document mattered beyond emotion. Its contents governed private possessions that could otherwise become the source of future disputes inside the family. One missing instruction could reopen questions Philip had believed he had already settled. The evidence made the silence harder to explain. A secondary archival register showed a date, an access code, and a chain of authorization linked to a private review involving staff assigned to Camilla's household. The Queen Consort had not yet been accused of personally taking anything, but her office now appeared inside the most sensitive part of the timeline. Anne followed the entries line by line until another detail stopped her cold. The decree had not been recorded as destroyed. It had not been officially transferred. No later instruction had replaced it. It had simply disappeared between two inventory checks, leaving behind a gap where procedure demanded an explanation. Anne placed both hands flat on the table and looked directly at the archivist. She wanted every access record from that night before anyone left the room. The official hesitated, then admitted that one request had come from a name tied directly to Camilla's private office. That was the moment grief hardened into suspicion. The Princess Royal no longer wanted reassurance. She wanted the truth. But before Anne could confront Camilla, she needed to understand why Philip's decree mattered so deeply, and why its disappearance threatened wounds inside the family that had never truly healed. To outsiders, the missing decree was a piece of paper. To Anne, it carried the voice of the man whose standards had shaped almost every part of her life. Philip had demanded discipline, loyalty, and brutal honesty from his children, and she had lived by those rules long after childhood ended. Camilla stood on the other side of that legacy, holding influence inside the monarchy Philip had once guarded fiercely. Suddenly, their histories were on a collision course. Anne had always understood her father in a way few people did. Prince Philip could be demanding, impatient, and brutally direct, but she respected exactly that quality because she knew where she stood with him. The Princess Royal, a title given to the monarch's eldest daughter as a mark of senior royal status, had spent decades working beside him at official engagements and absorbing his belief that duty meant doing what had been promised, even when nobody was watching. That was why one memory now returned with painful force. During a private family conversation years earlier, Philip had told her that possessions themselves meant little compared with respecting the wishes attached to them. Anne had never forgotten it. Now those words made the missing decree feel less like an administrative mistake and more like someone had crossed a boundary her father deliberately set. Camilla felt the pressure from a very different direction. Her position inside Charles's household gave her office access to sensitive schedules, internal coordination, and selected royal records, meaning any authorization linked to her staff could not simply be dismissed as meaningless. When she learned that Anne had demanded the complete access logs, her expression changed. Sitting privately with Charles, she asked whether his sister already knew whose authorization appeared in the register. The king did not answer. He only looked at her, and that silence carried more weight than reassurance ever could. Camilla understood Anne well enough to know that once she believed Philip's wishes had been disturbed, she would not stop at a convenient explanation. Charles then brought William into the matter. The prince understood immediately why the stakes had widened. If Philip's decree covered objects intended for younger generations, then any interference could affect not only Anne, but the future household William would one day lead. Charles explained what had been found, and the future king listened without interrupting. He knew this was no longer simply about the past. It touched succession, inheritance, and trust between branches of the family. Anne received the most troubling discovery shortly afterward. An archivist showed her a handwritten note attached to an older inventory entry stating that Philip had personally ordered the decree to remain untouched unless every named family party was informed first. No record of such notification existed. No signature confirmed approval. No message showed Anne had ever been told. Then a former equerry came forward through a documented account. He remembered the final time Philip discussed the decree and recalled a tense private conversation only days before it was sealed. Anne read his statement slowly. What happened in that room had seemed minor at the time. Now it looked like the beginning of everything. The missing decree had already reopened old loyalties, but the real fracture began years earlier, during one private conversation that would later look like the moment everything changed. Every royal crisis has a moment that appears insignificant until history circles back to it. In this story, that moment came during a private family gathering, when Philip was asked to reconsider part of his decree. The discussion lasted only minutes. His answer was absolute. Those who heard it understood that the Duke had drawn a line. And years later, when his instruction vanished, Anne would remember that conversation as the point of no return. Philip had created the decree to protect several personal objects, private family records, military keepsakes, and ceremonial possessions from simply disappearing into the wider royal collection after his death. A royal collection, in plain terms, is the body of artworks, objects, documents, and historic possessions held for the monarchy, rather than belonging privately to one individual. He wanted certain things handled differently. Rank was not supposed to decide everything. Personal relationships mattered, and that made the document unusually sensitive because it separated family inheritance from institutional ownership. Anne understood that distinction immediately. Camilla understood it too, and that was exactly why the Windsor conversation became so important. Camilla raised the concern carefully during a private family meeting. She argued that some items listed in the decree could later become associated with different branches of the family, creating awkward questions over ownership, public display, and future royal households. Philip did not soften. He told those present that his private possessions would go where he chose, and he would not rewrite his wishes simply because the arrangements might become inconvenient later. Anne saw the irritation in him at once. Charles saw it too. The king, then still caught between his father's authority and his wife's concern, chose not to challenge the decision again. But the silence that followed did not feel like agreement. It felt like unfinished business. Anne spoke to her father privately afterward. She asked whether he expected anyone to resist what he had written. Philip answered with the bluntness she knew so well. People suddenly become interested in rules when those rules stop them from getting what they want. The words stayed with her. Years later, they would return with devastating force, because the missing decree now looked less like coincidence and more like the very resistance he had anticipated. Then the former equerry's documented account changed the shape of the mystery. He revealed that a duplicate memorandum had been created immediately after the Windsor exchange. A memorandum was simply a written internal record designed to preserve an instruction clearly for those who might later need to act on it. This copy confirmed that Philip had deliberately reaffirmed the disputed portion of his decree. He had not weakened it, he had strengthened it. Anne read further and found the line that changed grief into anger. No later administrative review could alter the decree without written acknowledgement from two named family members. One of those names was hers. She lowered the page slowly. Nobody had asked her. Nobody had notified her. Yet the original decree was gone. That meant the person who removed it may not have wanted merely to read it. They may have needed its restrictions out of the way. Now Anne knew her father had anticipated resistance. What she did not yet know was whether Camilla had merely been connected to the missing decree or had played a direct role in making it disappear. Anne did not summon a committee. She did not send another aide. She asked for Camilla directly. When the two women finally faced each other behind a closed door, there were no photographers, no courtiers, and no ceremonial smiles to soften what had brought them there. Anne placed the access record between them and asked a single question. Why had an authorization connected to Camilla's office been used on the night Philip's decree disappeared? Camilla knew the meeting could no longer be avoided. The Queen Consort understood that a household authorization code was an internal access marker used by approved senior staff to request or handle sensitive material, and she insisted that such a code did not prove she personally touched the decree. Anne did not move. By then, she had seen too many gaps in the archive trail to accept another explanation built on procedure. Her father's instruction had been logged, protected, and explicitly restricted. Then it vanished. That mattered because the decree governed private wishes Philip had deliberately separated from normal royal administration, and because Anne herself had been named as someone who should have been informed before any review took place. Anne pushed the access sheet across the table. Camilla looked down at the authorization code, then back at her. Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Finally, the Princess Royal said, "My father said it was not to be touched." She refused to let the discussion drift toward staff systems or clerical routines. This was about Philip. She wanted to know whether Camilla had known his decree was being reviewed after his death. The question landed hard because the Queen could no longer answer with complete distance. Camilla's composure finally cracked. She admitted that she had known about a posthumous administrative review of some of Philip's private materials. An administrative review, in simple terms, was an internal examination meant to clarify how possessions or records should be handled after a death. She insisted the purpose had been to settle ownership questions, not erase his wishes. But when Anne accused her of trying to undo a decision Philip had refused to change while alive, Camilla reacted sharply. She said she had never intended to dishonor him, and accused Anne of entering the room, with her verdict already decided. Anne answered by producing a second record. It showed that the decree had been withdrawn from the archive shortly before the review officially began. That detail changed everything. If the review was only meant to clarify ownership, why had Philip's controlling instruction disappeared before the process even started? Camilla read the date again. This time her defense weakened. Then she gave Anne one final piece of information. The Queen told her to ask Charles, who had approved the review itself. Anne had entered the room believing she understood the betrayal. She left, realizing that Camilla might not have been the only person with power over Philip's final instruction, and the next name waiting inside the evidence belonged to her own brother. The confrontation changed everything, because it revealed a second layer to the mystery. Camilla's office may have been connected to the missing decree, but the review itself had required authority from higher inside the household. That authority belonged to Charles. For Anne, the discovery was almost unbearable. She had prepared herself to challenge her sister-in-law. She had not prepared herself to ask whether her own brother had permitted the machinery that placed their father's wishes at risk. Anne went to Charles with the evidence already arranged in her mind. The king, as sovereign, held authority over major royal administrative systems, but that did not mean he automatically controlled every private instruction left by a family member. That distinction mattered now because Philip's decree dealt with personal intentions, not simply crown property. Crown property meant assets held for the institution of the monarchy rather than privately owned by one individual. If Philip had deliberately separated certain possessions from that system, palace convenience could not simply erase his decision. Anne understood that. Charles understood it too. Charles did not deny signing an authorization after his father's death. He admitted approving a broad inventory review meant to clarify which possessions belonged privately to the family and which fell under wider royal management. But he insisted he had never ordered Philip's decree removed, hidden, or suppressed. Anne listened, then asked the question that cut deeper than any accusation against Camilla. Had protecting stability become more important to him than protecting their father's word? The monarch looked wounded. He told her he had been trying to hold together a family already divided by old resentments, competing households, and arguments over inheritance. He had wanted order. He had not wanted betrayal. Charles then placed the original review order in front of Anne. He told his sister she could remain angry with him, but she had to read what he had actually approved. She did. The decree was never mentioned. There was no instruction to isolate it, no command to remove it from the archive, and no authority to bypass Philip's safeguards. Anne read the page again. Her suspicion shifted. The king had opened the process, but something had happened after his signature left the room. William noticed it first. The prince studied a later copy and found a handwritten notation directing Philip's private decree to be held separately pending household clarification. An administrative notation was simply an added instruction telling staff how a document should be handled, but this one carried enormous weight. It had no initials from Charles. It did not match his handwriting, yet someone had treated it as if it belonged beneath his authority. Anne felt the case tighten around a new possibility. The wording echoed language used in correspondence from Camilla's private secretariat, the small office responsible for managing sensitive personal and household business on her behalf. That did not prove the Queen had written the instruction. It suggested something more precise and potentially more dangerous. Someone inside her administrative circle may have expanded Charles's order without his direct approval. The king had opened the door, but someone else had walked through it. And once Anne identified whose hand altered the process, the first real consequences began almost immediately. By the following morning, the disappearance of Philip's decree was no longer contained to one archive room. Senior staff were being questioned, access privileges were frozen, and loyalties inside the household were beginning to harden. Anne had moved from grief into determination. Camilla, meanwhile, faced a new reality. Even if she had never personally removed the document, the trail now led through people operating under her authority. The distinction mattered legally. Emotionally, it offered almost no protection. Charles acted before the uncertainty could spread any further. The king ordered an internal preservation measure, freezing access to Philip's remaining private archival material until every step surrounding the missing decree could be reconstructed. A preservation measure, in simple terms, meant temporarily locking down sensitive records so nothing could be moved, altered, or removed while the investigation continued. William supported the decision without hesitation. The prince understood that this had grown beyond one missing instruction. If the family could not guarantee the safety of a private royal directive, then every confidential arrangement left by a senior royal could suddenly be questioned. Trust itself was now at risk. Camilla felt that shift immediately. She was informed that one of her senior private office officials had been removed from archival duties, while investigators examined the authorization trail. The queen consort read the notice, folded it once, and asked everyone to leave. Only after the door closed did her composure fall. Her household was no longer sitting at the edge of the inquiry. It had become the center of it. Whether she had personally handled the decree almost stopped mattering, because the actions of people working under her authority were now being measured against Philip's explicit wishes. Anne received another blow soon afterward. A documented inventory review confirmed that the decree contained provisions protecting sentimental objects meant for Philip's descendants, including personal keepsakes that carried family meaning rather than institutional value. She had known the document mattered, but now the emotional cost became sharper. If the decree had remained missing, younger members of the family might never have received the things he had specifically chosen for them. For the Princess Royal, that possibility was unbearable. Someone had not merely disrupted paperwork. They may have interrupted a final act of affection from a father to his family. Then, investigators found the transfer log. It showed that the decree had been removed from the archival room inside a sealed portfolio, and delivered not to another protected archive, but to a private palace office. That office had been temporarily assigned to a member of Camilla's administrative team during the exact week the decree vanished. The chain was tightening. A retired staff member then broke his silence through a recorded interview given to the internal inquiry. He remembered the portfolio clearly. It did not remain in that office overnight. Late that evening, someone senior arrived and collected it personally. No signature was requested because the individual's authority was considered sufficient. The evidence had finally reached Camilla's inner circle, but the turning point would not come from another register or signature. It would come from what she chose to tell Anne when there was no one left between them. For the first time since the crisis began, Camilla asked to speak with Anne alone. No secretaries, no king, no palace lawyers. When Anne entered, she expected another defense. Instead, Camilla admitted that she had known the decree was removed from its original file. The confession did not prove the darkest suspicion, but it destroyed the last comfortable explanation. What followed was not an argument over procedure. It was two women confronting the damage caused by a decision neither could now undo. Camilla explained that after Philip's death, her office had raised concerns about several personal items whose future public use might create disputes between different royal households. The queen consort said the fear was not about ownership alone, but about how certain possessions could later be displayed, claimed, or interpreted by separate branches of the family. A household repository, in simple terms, was a secure internal storage location used for sensitive private material outside the main archive. She admitted that she agreed the decree could be temporarily separated, while those questions were reviewed. She believed it would remain protected and eventually be returned. That decision, she now understood, had been the beginning of the crisis. Anne felt the admission like a second betrayal. The Princess Royal reminded her that Philip's written instruction had specifically forbidden that kind of intervention without her knowledge. Temporary removal changed nothing. Her father had created the safeguard because he did not want private convenience to override his final wishes. She told Camilla that whether the decree disappeared for one night or 1 year, the principle was the same. Someone had crossed a line he had deliberately drawn. Camilla did not fight the point this time. She acknowledged that she should have stopped the process before it began. She insisted she never ordered the decree destroyed, altered, or permanently concealed. Instead, She admitted that her attempt to prevent future conflict between royal households had helped create something far worse: distrust between the people Philip had expected to protect his wishes. Anne listened without interrupting. The anger remained, but beneath it something else had begun to emerge. For the first time, she was hearing responsibility instead of denial. Then Camilla gave her the name of the senior aide who had physically arranged the transfer. According to a documented internal account, that official moved the decree into a locked household repository after the administrative review. Anne immediately understood what that meant. If the account was accurate, the document might still exist. The search was no longer about proving who interfered with Philip's instruction. It was about finding the original, before anyone could challenge what he had actually written. Camilla slid a handwritten reference number across the table. Anne looked at it, but did not touch it immediately. The Queen spoke quietly. "That is where they said it went." Anne finally picked up the number. For the first time, suspicion had become a destination, and if Philip's missing decree was still there, recovering it would not end the crisis. It would expose exactly what had been removed, and make the argument inside the palace impossible to keep from the outside world. The missing decree was found inside the household repository, exactly where the internal reference led. Its seal had been broken, but its pages remained intact. For Anne, seeing her father's signature again brought relief so sharp that it nearly became grief. For the palace, however, recovery did not end the crisis. It confirmed that Philip's instruction had been removed without Anne's required acknowledgement. And once that fact reached the public, a private family dispute became a national royal reckoning. Anne watched as the recovered decree was checked against the original archival registration, signature references, and inventory record. Authentication, in simple terms, meant confirming that the document was genuine by matching it against the official records created when it was first stored. Every detail aligned. The pages were Philip's. The instructions were intact. That mattered, because the family no longer had to rely on memories, secondary notes, or competing explanations. His exact wishes had survived. Charles immediately ordered that the decree be restored without amendment, and that every possession covered by it be reviewed according to what his father had actually written. Anne reached the signature and stopped. The Princess Royal let her fingers rest over her father's name before closing the folder. Anger was still there, but relief finally broke through it. Philip's final instruction had not been destroyed. It had not been rewritten. The family could still carry out what he intended. Yet that relief came with pain, because Anne knew the document had survived only after being removed in direct conflict with the safeguard he had created. Camilla now faced the consequences of her own admission. The Queen Consort had acknowledged that she allowed the decree to be separated during the review, and Charles made clear in a private recorded conversation, preserved for the internal inquiry, that protecting reputation could never justify bypassing Philip's explicit boundary. The king did not publicly humiliate her, but privately, he left no room for misunderstanding. The intervention had been wrong. Then the palace issued its confirmation. The decree had not been rewritten or secretly replaced. Instead, it had been removed through an unauthorized administrative intervention that prevented it from remaining where Philip ordered it to be kept. The distinction mattered. It cleared one fear while confirming another. Someone had deliberately stepped outside the process. Public reaction came fast. A fictional morning edition of the London Chronicle carried the stark headline, "Philip's Lost Order Found," while a crowd gathered outside Buckingham Palace as broadcasters repeated the confirmation. Sympathy moved strongly toward Anne. To the public, she had become the family member who refused to let administrative convenience erase a dead father's wishes. Charles caught up with his sister as she left the archive room and asked whether finding the decree changed anything. Anne answered without hesitation. "It changed everything," she said. But it did not erase what happened. The document was back where Philip wanted it. What remained was harder, deciding what the betrayal meant, who would carry its consequences, and whether Anne could finally let her father's final word rest. In the end, the crisis was never truly about a missing decree. It was about whether the wishes of a man who had spent a lifetime serving the crown could survive the pressures that followed his death. Anne had been shattered because the disappearance felt like an attempt to silence her father when he could no longer defend himself. But when the decree was restored and its instructions honored exactly as Philip wrote them, she achieved the one victory that mattered. His voice had survived. Charles moved quickly once the internal findings were complete. The king formally returned Philip's decree to protected archival status and ordered every provision to be carried out exactly as written. Protected archival status, in simple terms, meant the document would be preserved under strict access rules, so nobody could move, alter, or reinterpret it without proper authority. The internal review reached a clear conclusion as well. The decree had not been lawfully cancelled or destroyed. It had been deliberately separated during the household review, without the approvals Philip had required. That distinction mattered because it confirmed the problem was not confusion. Someone had crossed a boundary. Anne met her brother privately after the decision was finalized. She told Charles that her anger had never been about who received which possession. The Princess Royal had been fighting for something far more personal, the right of their father to make his own final choices and trust that his family would respect them. The monarch listened without interrupting. He finally admitted that his instinct to protect stability had blinded him to how deeply administrative compromise could damage private trust. Anne did not soften the truth for him, but she also did not turn the conversation into punishment. For the first time, brother and sister were speaking about Philip instead of the crisis built around him. Camilla then gave Anne a direct apology in a documented private conversation. The Queen Consort acknowledged that allowing the decree to be separated had been wrong, even if she had believed the decision was temporary. Anne accepted the apology without pretending everything between them was repaired. Trust had been damaged, and both women knew it. But the apology mattered, because it finally recognized the boundary Philip had drawn. The senior aide who arranged the undocumented transfer was permanently removed from sensitive archival work, while new safeguards required 2 family acknowledgements before any private royal instruction could ever be relocated again. Anne finally received one of the personal objects Philip had designated for her. The item itself mattered less than what it represented. Holding it brought back the grief she had postponed while fighting through records, confrontations, and unanswered questions. Her anger began to loosen. Her father's wishes had survived. His possessions were distributed as he intended. No administrative shortcut could now change that. Anne closed the restored decree for the final time after every provision had been confirmed. Charles remained beside her. She told him their father would have hated all the fuss, but he would have expected them to get it right. Camilla remained part of the family, but humbled. The king learned that protecting the monarchy could never justify sacrificing private trust. And Anne became the person who made sure Philip's final wishes were not rewritten by convenience. And they finally did. Philip's decree remained intact. His wishes were carried out. And Anne walked away, knowing that although trust had been damaged, her father's final word had not been erased. The scandal had shaken the family, humbled Camilla, and forced Charles to confront the price of compromise. But it ended with one unmistakable verdict. Philip's wishes stood, Anne defended them, and the monarchy was forced to remember that even inside a crown built on power, loyalty still begins with keeping one's word. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.